Welcome to the August 9th meeting of the Finance and Legal Guild for the Lifeboat Academy. I am, because we are actually seeing the land in front of Becca, I am minded to do a land acknowledgement. The order of we begin with the land because the land was here before we were. The land will continue to be here long after we are gone. And everything that we have and need and are comes from the land and returns to the land. And this is an important reminder at the beginning of our time together so that we can put our choices and our options into context. And we can remember how we are all in this together and we are all interconnected. And in doing so, we simultaneously acknowledge our debt of gratitude to Indigenous cultures who have kept this wisdom alive and are willing to share it with us at a time when our culture desperately needs it as a corrective, as a healing opportunity. And that gratitude also hopefully inspires with us a desire to be in right relations with all of our relations, our human and more than human relations, and recognizing that to be in right relations means that we need to acknowledge where relationships have become unbalanced or have been harmed, and do what we can to heal any harms that have happened, and to figure out how do we move forward in a good way. And so this morning I feel called to dedicate our work to being in right relations with all of our relations. And even as we talk about legal structures and financing options and stakeholders and investments and things like that, let us remember that the real work here is to figure out how we can be in right relations with each other and with all of our relations. So with that, welcome home. This has been very cool. This is I'm so happy. I feel like, Becca, you have offered us the grounding. And so
Happy to. Yeah.
with that, we've done a little bit of a check-in on how we're all doing, but let's just go once around and talk about what is on the agenda for each of us, just to make sure that we're working in a way that works for everyone. And what I have on my agenda is I'd like to go over the final, what I'm hoping is the final simplified version of our diagram of the Lifeboat Academy, and then talk about how we could use that, what the next steps are, and that's what's on my agenda. And the circle, as I see it, is Becca, Roland, and me. So Becca, over to you. What's on your agenda today?
That sounds good, what you said. And also, I'm contemplating a possible trip out there.
Hmm.
I don't know if it'll happen, but I'm hoping. And so I want to run dates by you just in case there's things I need to avoid.
Cool. Very cool.
And I forget who you said was next.
Roland.
Over to
Um,
Ron.
yeah, that sounds good for me too. And I have a question around the membership of the Finance and Legal Guild. So back to Ben.
All right. I'm just making some notes here, and I will start my screen share.
And Heather's just sent me a message to say, are we having a meeting now? Can you send me the link? So I'm going to send her the link.
Awesome. Great. So I think we're ready. What I'll do is start to share. Let's see if I can do it. I'm just curious to see how it shows up here.
Keep an eye out for Heather coming into the room.
Awesome. So I have simplified one more time And now the general layout is there's sort of phase 1 and phase 2, what it looks like to build a lifeboat, and then what we're hoping the ecosystem of multiple lifeboats associated in the mutual aid network would look like. And then 2 options for how the legal arrangements could work, and kind of what I'm hoping is like the either end of the continuum, so there could be options in between. And one end of the continuum is a single entity that does that, it's one legal entity and everything's done within that. And then the other is everything is broken out into separate legal organisms. So I don't think I've really made any changes to this from the last time, except some cosmetic things. I've increased the font size for some things to try to make it a little bit more legible. But basically the story that this is telling is phase 1 is about resources and the Lifeboat Academy coming together to support lifeboat builders. So there's a development phase. And in the end, they are trying to create a local lifeboat that brings together all of these stakeholders. So that's the moral of the first diagram. And then the moral of the second diagram is that once we have multiple lifeboats, there is an organization that holds the land, and that there's a sort of a lease and or profit sharing arrangement between the separate social enterprises. So they like basically have there's an umbrella organization that holds the property, and that each of the local ones then has access to the property, works like a social enterprise, are connected in a mutual aid network, and that part of the profit that is being created in the lifeboats is then reinvested in building more lifeboats. So those are both process sort of independent of legal structure. And so I guess I'll pause there before getting on to so any comments, questions, concerns, etc. Becca, over to you.
Yeah, I was able to watch you talk track of this also this morning, and I think I'm wondering if we really need the first diagram to start, if I'm imagining a presentation to potential shareholders, and it seems like I really value the process idea of like, here's where we're at, we need to move towards this other thing, but I found it like a little too vague. Like my mind already wanted to go into what's the legal entity and what is the Lifeboat Academy and how is it different from lifeboat builders, and so I'm wondering if we could get away with just talking about here's what we're planning, and anyway, I have comments, a few comments about the later stuff too, but
okay. I'm trying to get the comments. I have to switch screens because I wanted to capture the comments in the notes on Asana and get back there. So it was just taking me a while to get the mechanics to work. So, and do you have other comments on the second diagram or on the legal structure part?
I think it's on the legal structure part.
Okay, we'll save that for.
Yeah.
Okay, and Roland, over to you.
It's so far so good for me. I am curious to hear what Becca has to say. Oh, other people, Becca. Yeah. So back to you, Ben.
Okay. Yeah, and what I'm hearing in that is also potential sequencing. It might be that, we start with the ecosystem, sort of the big vision, and then it backs into, how do we get there?
Yeah.
And I think that what's important for me to convey, and I don't know the right way of conveying it, but that there is a separate legal arrangement for the lifeboat bill, or that it is yeah, there's a sub process around the development and the thing itself. So, just to make sure that there's an idea that we're not going to, well, and I don't know, maybe we present it as though we just dive into the full-blown thing. But it won't, that's the only, my concern is to make sure that people are clear that, there's a process between, building the lifeboat and the lifeboat existing. Which actually maybe there isn't, because building the lifeboat is the lifeboat. So anyhow, so in terms of the ends of the continuum, there is the single organization. So we have a multi-stakeholder co-op that is the highest level, and that everything underneath it, including the Lifeboat Academy as the educational arm, and the local lifeboats are just circles or departments under this organization. And so there's no separate legal entity. They're all combined. And then the social impact investors in that model could be either providing a loan or shareholders. And so it's still one legal entity. And then the social impact investors just have a different arrangement within that legal entity. So that is, and then I just put this on this morning as a way of saying, and any additional lifeboats would then just kind of be birthed as separate circles, so no need to form a new legal organization. They can just be nested under the larger organization. And then at the other extreme is everything is separated out and there are separate legal structures. So there's still the multi-stakeholder co-op at the local level. And then there is a co-op of co-ops. So it's an organization of organizations at the high level. And then doesn't have to be, but I would just sort of differentiation. The social impact investors could be a separate B Corp with a triple bottom line goal. And then the Lifeboat Academy would be a nonprofit. And the lifeboat building would be sort of a separate contract, within this legal structure. So those lifeboats that were in development would be like a development contract separate from the other organizations. Because, and the reason for that is that they would need to form another multi-stakeholder co-op. So you would have to have something forming here. Anyhow, those are, again, I was just trying to do like anchors on either end. And, we could scale back. The social investors could just be investors, not have a separate legal entity, but the Lifeboat Academy could be, so that it could be a nonprofit. So anyhow, that's where that is at. So again, comments, questions, concerns, over to you, Becca.
So I can see the value of both of these ends of the continuum, and I do think it's useful for where we're at right now to have them both spelled out. And it was interesting because when I was looking at the one that was like the multi-entity model, I was sort of laughing because, we had this questions about, should it be a B Corp? Should it be a nonprofit? Should it be a co-op? And it's sort of like, yes, all of the above. And I am leery of overly complex things, especially in the startup phase. And so I think we should lean into the question, like, what disadvantages, if any, would there be to the single entity, especially to start with, and then because we can build out other entities as needed later, and I don't know, just really nervous about trying to create a too many things at once that we don't have the capacity to create. Like, I think creating one entity that we know about, like a co-op or a nonprofit, like a B Corp with social impact bond, just like, I don't know anything about that. I don't know how to help with that. But I get that we're trying to like have materials for conversation with potential investors. And so maybe it makes sense to have that as a possibility, and see if they're like, oh yeah, I'd rather do that. And then I also think that in these diagrams, potential investors who haven't heard about this stuff before, and even those of us who have, on my more confused days, I'm still like, what's the difference between being a social impact investor and being a fair share sponsor or a insurance policy holder? And if that answer differs between these two models, I think it would be especially important to know it. Like, could somebody be a shareholder in the B Corp, or an investor in the B Corp, and one of those other roles in a local lifeboat? And would that mean that they had to sort of have two different roles in two different organizations? Or if it's one multi-stakeholder co-op, could a person, just have multiple roles in one organization? Right? And is it even multiple roles? So those are all my questions at the moment. Over to Roland.
And I'm going to say this out loud because it is, I'm sort of reframing the way that I'm understanding what the legal structure means for us. And I think it is we're engaging in the thinking around insurance, because it could be that there's ways that we are supposed to do things depending on the legal structure, but I think ultimately we may not need any of this stuff if everything goes well, everybody gets along well, and we don't really need any of it. So I'm thinking about it as this is insurance in case something happens. And I also understand that it's also a way for us to be able to talk about how we hope things are going to work with potential participants. And I'm using the word participant instead of investor or whatever. So it's, for me, a participant feels like a more global way of referring to everyone who will be and is involved. I'm curious about actually illegally having the category of nonprofit included, and because I know that there are grants and funds that are available for nonprofit organizations. So just strategically, is it a good idea to have that category included? And we've talked about it, and I guess I'm curious about where we're at with thinking about being able to talk about the build out vision, and also being able to talk about it in terms of steps, because including the notion of steps is that people who become involved in what do we need to start, and people who become involved in the starting point can also become part of how the next steps unfold, and that's actually part of our process, that our process is to try to be responsive to what's happening and who is involved. So those are my comments. And actually, I think also I would like to know what kind of legal problems there might be with one person being involved in more than one level or more than one category. Uh, uh, I would like for one person to be able to be part of more than one category. Yeah. So I guess that's it for me. Back to you, Ben.
Um, uh, so uh, in ways, I feel like it feels like we keep going round and round, and part of the issue is everything has pros and cons. And so we have a number of dynamic, sort of those dynamics that simply exist. The more complicated something becomes, the harder it is to explain, the more problems there are that can enter into it, but also the more customized it can be to the particular people involved in what we're doing. So on the other side, simple is good unless it's simplistic. Simple is good unless it forces people who don't have the same understanding desires to, make the same choice, or if it prevents choices that some people would find appealing. And so that's one of those dynamics. And one of the other dynamics that I see perpetually is it's what you're talking about, Roland, is a lot of what we're doing is, or a lot of what I'm doing is I'm trying to imagine what would this person need to get involved? What are they looking for? And what they all need is different. And so, but then, and part of the underlying challenge is, and we may bend over backwards and create a space for them, and they may not show up anyhow. Right. So, I like the idea of it developing as people get on board. And I think that the kind of circling back to, uh, I think Becca's framing is the right framing. How simple can we keep it? Like, what are the, if we go for the dead simple version to start, what are the risks? And what are some actions we can take to mitigate the most immediate risks in how we're starting? The the nonprofit and for-profit having a separate one, I totally think that can be done later. Like we are not talking about being dependent on grants for what we're doing. So, the ability to apply for and get grants is something that we may be interested in next year, but not right off the bat. But the flip side is the nonprofit part is if we can find a way where people can make a donation and it be tax deductible, or invest in property in a way that you get, a charitable receipt for the property, then that's a big deal. So, and that's actually has more to do with, can there be a relationship with the farmers union, or, like Heather was talking about at the last meeting, is there another entity? And that's not going to be us, right? Like, I don't think we want to get into figuring out how we can hold land as a charitable thing, because I mean, food lands, that's what they're trying to do, and they've been trying to do that for 10 years. So, so I think that, and what Heather was suggesting last time, I think was I feel like this is the way to go, is forming a multi-stakeholder co-op, whether it ends up only being the local co-op or it becomes the bigger co-op, we still need a multi-stakeholder co-op. And so that seems pretty much like, well, let's do that. I think let's talk about what are the risks involved in that model. And that's where the social impact investors, separate from the fair share sponsors and the insurance policy holders, the big difference is the fair share sponsors and the insurance policy holders are very similar to the impact investors, and I could see an impact investor becoming one of them. But there are, in talking with Joey, we were trying to talk to people who want to do good generally in the world, but are not invested in this property in this at this time. You know, they're not thinking, they don't have a personal connection to here and now, but they do have the means and the capacity to make that available for folks, right? You know, they've got the financial resources and they've got an interest in general in doing something good for, you know, our time in history. So that's where there's going to be a hesitation. The pitch that we could make to fair share sponsors is different than that won't resonate with a social impact investor necessarily. A social impact investor may become a fair share sponsor, but I don't think we would assume the same interest from the start. And so they're going to have more questions about, how do I get my money back? How can I be sure that this is a good investment? You know, more of those kind of brass tacks things, and less concern about, oh, I really like what you're doing here. I mean, there's an element of I like what you're doing here, right? But it's not. I think, you know, for what I'm thinking about is the insurance policyholders and the fair share sponsors are like, I want to be a part of that. You know, I want to be a part of that enterprise. And but the social impact investors are maybe not, you know, that committed to it. So that's I think one of the fundamental sort of differences in terms of or accommodations. It's an upfront accommodation to how do we deal with the people who are not fully in on the lifeboat, but are potentially there for making resources available. So with that, I'm gonna, I think, another round just to keep it going. So Becca, over to you.
Didn't you say in your talk track at least that if the multi-stakeholder, I'm really on board with, let's just start with a multi-stakeholder co-op if we can mitigate whatever risks are involved in that. Didn't you say that if it was a services cooperative, it could also receive grants and donations?
Yeah, community services co-ops are, yeah. And I think we can set up a multi-stakeholder community services co-op. I think you can, they're not, I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Okay, so then the question would be, what disadvantages would there be of doing it that way? Because then we would have the grant donation tax deduction thing. This may be jumping too far ahead. We could save it for another round, but I'm just having a little lack of clarity in my mind is like, is the next step taking a couple options to Joey or talking to lawyers, or are we really trying to pick one today? Over to Roland.
Okay, so the multi-stakeholder co-op can receive money and give receipts for it?
It's not a charity, but it's a nonprofit.
Okay.
So yeah, we could apply for grants as a nonprofit, and we would, so there would be resources and programs that would be available to us, but we cannot issue a charity receipt.
Okay.
That's a separate level of.
Does that mean that a multi-stakeholder co-op is held to the same regulations as not-for-profit organizations?
A community service, a multi-stakeholder co-op is separate from community services co-ops. So a community services co-op is the nonprofit equivalent of a co-op. Okay. And it has the same standards of, you know, it can't produce a profit, it can't provide dividends. There are some the limitations on investment actually, I think, turn out to not be any different than on any other organization, other nonprofit, but yeah, the multi-stakeholder is distinct from community services.
Okay. Okay. I think I want to listen more, so I'm going to pass to you, Ben.
Well, I think actually, Becca, I think the question is like, what are the next steps? And in the same vein of, you know, what are the risks of, moving forward on different things? I think one of my concerns about one of the things that will come up really quickly is in a multi-stakeholder co-op, you can have a separate set of shares that are for investors. And so then the question becomes, how do they work? In some sense, we get into, so maybe it might be, this is, I think, a good argument for another meeting with the lawyers to say, okay, we think we want to move forward on a multi-stakeholder co-op, and we want to set it up in a way that it could potentially grow out, these other things, but we're thinking it could also just stay one. What do we do? Like the lawyers can kind of coach us through. But I think then there's still the question. So I think it's maybe a both and, because I think there's a question of not just Joey, because I think Heather brought up there are other organizations who also could be in a position to sponsor this, and so talking to a couple different perspectives on, if we were to have a multi-stakeholder option, then for the investors, I think if I remember correctly from the lawyers, the big question is loan versus separate share. And loan, if I remember correctly, loan is neatest, tidiest. Because basically they're a mortgage holder, they get paid out first if we dissolve, and you don't get into all of the governance responsibilities and that sort of thing. But if they would like to have more, and that's so the comfort for the investors is they get their money back and their hands are clean. But some investors are going to not feel comfortable not having some say in how things are going. So some investors would like to trade that financial cleanliness for having some influence in how the organization works. So they actually want a share because they want some say at the board. So yeah, I think that, well, and I'm wondering if it seems to me like we could probably do both of those. Actually, all three of those. I think we pick enough of one so that we can go back to the lawyers and say, okay, right now, this is what we're thinking. Multi-stakeholder, either community services or not community services, with investors as a loan. That's what we're thinking. And talk to the lawyers about, how that gets set up, but simultaneously talk to potential investors and say, would you prefer to be, we're forming a multi-stakeholder co-op. Here's how you could support it. Yeah, actually, and we could just present it as the funny thing in all of this is the bylaws that I wrote are for a multi-stakeholder co-op. It's all one organization that allows for, these other things to happen. So, actually I take it back, because it's a B Corp. But it's a single organization that basically the roles that we've been talking about are written into the bylaws. So in some sense, we can probably just go and update the bylaws that we have to say multi-stakeholder co-op and change the relevant terms throughout it, and maybe have something to go with there. So I am going to pass back to Becca, but I also have to do a quick bio break. So I will, I'm going to turn on my closed captioning so I can follow along after I get back. Over to you, Becca.
We also could just wait for you to come
I
back.
guess we can edit that out. I'll be right back then.
And on that note, I will pause the recording.
All right, so we were talking sort of next steps, and back over to you, Becca.
Yeah, so I like what you said, Ben, about what if we provisionally, I think what I heard was, what if we provisionally pick the multi-stakeholder cooperative, initiate the next round with the lawyers about, you know, what would that look like, and how do we just tell whether we need a community services one or how those mesh with each other, and what are the implications for the bylaws and separate shares for investors. And I think you said simultaneously go to potential investors to say, here's what we're setting up to start with. And then maybe we could even add, like, you know, would this work for you? Or would you also want, you know, like something where you have more direct say, or a B Corp, or, you know, there's these other options we've considered, you know, that we could talk to you about if you're interested, but not sure that this structure will work for you, rather than trying to take all these diagrams at the outset to Joey. Over to Roland.
I guess to start, I'm wondering, with Bill and Elliot, is it in terms of next steps, is it to have a meeting, or are we more at the email level, sort of proposing we'd like to meet? We were thinking of meeting about this because I'm also thinking about the budget that we have for meeting with them. And even though I would feel like I find it more useful to actually be able to talk to someone, just in terms of being mindful about the budget, it may be, you know, we think we're ready to meet. This is what we have. Do you agree, or do you need something else before we have another conversation? And I think that leads to my next question around that is, do we feel like we're ready for them to draft something? And how close should we be thinking about how close we can get to where we want them to draft something before meeting with them again? Or do we need an interim meeting to be able to get to that point? Over to you, Ben.
It's a good question. Another one of those dynamics. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think we have agreed in principle that we do as much as we can on our side before engaging the lawyers. And I think that we engage them as lightly as possible and, you know, really lean into their expertise. So it's making me think, you know, referring to the original bylaws, if I think that knowing what I know now, I think I could probably take our bylaws, our one set of, you know, what do they call them? Constitutional documents or something, like foundational documents or something.
Constating.
There we go. Constating document. I have the one, and I think I could actually try. Here are the articles of incorporation, which whatever they're called for co-op. Retool them for a basic multi-stakeholder co-op. Take all of the sociocracy stuff, move that into bylaws. And yeah, anything and all of the process stuff, move that into the bylaws, which would in effect establish the the multi-stakeholder part, you know, like how those different parts work, and then run it past them as a, you know, here we think our bylaws and our articles of incorporation, you know, it'll give them something really concrete and specific to respond to. And I think likewise, those questions, you know, should it be community services? Actually, I can look at the language again in terms of like you can find you put this line in to make it a community services co-op. It's like that's how these things work. There's like this is the line, you put in this line and this, and you now have a community services one, you put in this line and this, and you've got a, you know, employee owned one. Anyhow, so I guess that's what I'm proposing. The other thing too is on the notes, I guess you're not seeing the notes screen, but I want to make sure that we're not thinking just of Joey. I think Joey is definitely a key resource, but we've expanded our investment pool. And I also want to try to bounce things off of Brad Smith and Bernie. And actually, this is an open question. I'd like people's feedback. I wonder if, you know, Brad is representing sort of 15 properties and Bernie's got another property, and there's some other people that we've encountered who have properties and like who have physical properties and they're looking to do something similar. And is there an advantage of if we can figure out some way of working with them? You know, is there an economies of scale or something if we try to figure out a solution that kind of works for all of us? Or is that just making it more complicated and we should just try to figure out like how we launch this one property? And at the very least, I think it'd be interesting to kind of get their feedback. I don't think there's any, you know, kind of cost in setting up a conversation with Brad and Bernie and just saying, here's what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? But, you know, does it go any further than that? If they say, well, you know, good luck on that. I mean, I'm not, to tell you the truth, I'm not entirely convinced that there's a value legally in us all being associated, but maybe. Anyhow, just random thoughts. Back over to you, Becca.
So I think this tension between not spending too much money, but not wandering around in the dark on our own with the lawyer without the lawyers is worth, you know, naming and figuring out where to be. I do think either from the lawyers or if there's research that we could do, it would be good to know whether multi-stakeholder and community services cooperative can be blended or not, because that, I don't know, maybe even if they can't, and we have to pick one, we would still say, okay, we're just going to start with a multi-stakeholder. And, but I'm confused about that because I think the ability to get grants is important. And maybe not a deal breaker, but and I think that it might make sense rather than you just going off and doing all that work that you described, which would be great to have done, to send an email to the lawyers with a few questions, including, you know, here's what we're thinking, here's what we think we can do on our end. Does that make sense as the next step? Or is it, because I would hate to see you spend a lot of time, because your time is as valuable as my money, frankly, or more, is more valuable than my money in a sense. And so like, I don't want us to just be continuously, you know, putting a ton of your time into something that then turns out not to be a legally viable document. And maybe email is a compromise between meeting and, I mean, they charge us for every email, so it's not, it doesn't save a lot, but it at least seems like it might be a little bit less expensive to ask a few questions to start with. over to Roland.
Oh, you're muted.
Muted. There, I'm unmuted. I think that was a lot of the background in my thinking. So thanks for putting words to it. I don't know if I would have been able to. Um, so in terms of Brad Smith and Bernie, I think they may not be interested, but they may be able to. Whether or not they're interested, I think that we could get some useful information, even if it's just because from anyway, and this is a oral tradition thing where I get to repeat and get feedback to see if we're still on the same page about this, that one of the things that we're working towards is the replicability of doing this. And so getting feedback from other people who are having similar but different experiences is information that could be useful in helping us take this first stab at a replicable model. So I think, and I think Becca's point about time, about the time that it takes and the value of that time is also good. So is this time well spent? Um, and then there's also, Becca, you were talking about being able to receive grants is important, and it made me wonder in terms of, I mean, part of what we're talking about is optics. What does it look like? We're to potential participants, and so specifically the ability to be able to apply for grants. How would that impact the optics for different types of participants? Would it be considered a negative for anyone? Would it be considered, is it actually a way of being able to, and if it is a negative for anyone, is it actually a useful tool in helping us to be able to weed out potential participants who aren't on the same page, So I think I am curious about this question and how being able to say we can apply for grants, how that could be beneficial in getting people onto this particular form of a lifeboat. Yeah, okay. So back to Ben.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Becca, for that. I think you laid out a very, very logical sequence. Don't do the work until it makes sense. And it does seem like a kind of splitting the middle. So the question would be, are you interested in writing that email? Because you've been the one I know we're looped in. But is that something that you would be willing to take on? And I think, then collectively, what are the questions that we have? One is, can you do community services and multi-stakeholder at the same go? That's a good question. What other questions do we have? I think actually the other question would be that I would have. They mentioned it before, and maybe it's a question that involves going to our notes, but they kind of laid out, here are the ways investors could be engaged in the co-op. And, they kind of said it's option 1, 2, or 3, I think, if I remember correctly. But just having like clarity on, here are the ways that the investors could be incorporated into the co-op. Anyhow, I think that I'm totally, sign me up for let's send the lawyers an email. I think it is a very reasonable investment of money to, for overall efficiency. I agree with what you're saying, Roland, too, about, yeah, that's actually part of the conversation. Well, and in terms of next steps, I was thinking immediately, and I'm also thinking about for the fall, what conversations. I am aware of the fact that we have a lot of people who have expressed interest in what we're doing that we haven't really checked in with in quite a while, potential investors. And we have some new folks who are on our radar who we haven't really engaged much with. And as we're planning our fall semester, one of the things we talked about at the outreach meeting was, we've got these different audiences. And if we can think about what are one or two things that we want to do for each of those audiences in the fall. And so part of what I'm wondering about is how can we use, so there's the simplified diagram, but then there's all of the different versions of diagrams that we have. And we've talked about this before about like, could we have a meeting of potential investors that, a circle of potential investors, and how would we do that? Like what would we need as a sort of making sure that we're all starting on the same page? And then, could we do a circle process? And what would be the goal of that? So that I'm not the next, I think the next step is figuring out what the fall step is. So I think our immediate next steps are an email to the lawyer. I would like to go on record as saying I have, for the first time, I think ever, I have put a date on the calendar. I want us to have a legal entity by the end of September. I think we can do it. I think we're close enough. If we're going to go forward with a multi-stakeholder co-op, I think we can have a multi-stakeholder co-op formed by September, by the end of September. And the question is then what? What are the steps after? And it's a little bit, what are the next steps, and also how can we take that and use it to our advantage? What are some actions that we can attach to that for the fall semester? So anyhow, I am, part of my bouncy brain this morning is next Monday is our coordination circle where we are hoping to finalize our fall plan. So I'm thinking in two tracks. I'm thinking directly about finance and legal, and also how finance and legal fits in with other events. So anyhow, with that, back over to you, Becca.
I feel a little bit unsure about drafting the email to the lawyers because of, I don't know even where the notes are. For you mentioned, oh, we should check the notes because, so I'd rather not do that by myself. I'm happy to help with it. And it doesn't have to come from me. Like if you feel like you know what you need to say, and in some ways it feels like I might be delaying things by being between you and the lawyers sometimes, and I don't want that to happen. If that's happening or might happen. And I like the idea of me meeting a circle practice of potential investors a lot. There's also the one-to-one idea from last time that I'm willing to do. I don't know if you were looking at my face when you said by end of September. I'm like, what? You're really? And I think that feels aspirational and maybe not impossible, but I'm skeptical just because of the timeline we've been on, especially because even when we're ready, the lawyers then have delays. So, but it could end up being simple, boilerplate, once we've figured out that we want to, if we do indeed stick with a multi-stakeholder cooperative. And I love that you're thinking about the whole project and not just this piece of it. So I thought I heard a hint of apology there. Don't apologize. when you were bringing in the fall plan and everything. Like, yeah, that's exciting to hear about and important for us to be coordinating with that if possible. Over to Roland.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add at this point about this particular item on the agenda. So I'll just pass back to Ben.
I'm just trying to capture notes on next steps to make sure that
while you're doing that, I will just blather a little bit, and you reminded me of the reminder email that was requested from the coordination circle for a few days before. So that's going to be one of the things on my list of things to do is to remind people about what we all said we were going to do, including me, because I also have a memory like a sieve, and I try to remedy that by making notes for myself everywhere. And then it's dependent on whether or not I actually look at one of those places for what am I going to do next, that whether or not they actually get done. So have I blathered enough? Are you ready?
yes.
Okay, over to you, Ben.
Okay, so I think I can certainly I understand not wanting to be a holdup in the process, and I also want to make sure that I feel more comfortable when I have more eyes on what I am producing, just to make sure that I'm not missing things or distorting it in my memory. So what I could easily do is write up just a really quick, here's what we think, that basically I will turn these bullet points into an email. So here's our plan. We're gonna separate things out. Multi-stakeholder co-op, can we do it as a community services co-op as well? What are some of the options? And I will try to look into the notes to see what they said, and maybe actually pick one as we think that, the best option is. And so then that is the lawyer line, and then we also have outreach to and I think this is where so what I can tell you, Becca, in terms of I can tell you from fact, because I've done it 3 times, it takes about a half an hour to legally incorporate an entity. And if you use boilerplate, that's it, you're done. And so we could just say, fuck the lawyers, we're going to do a multi-stakeholder co-op, we're going to do a bare bones Constantine document or whatever, and we could do it today. So a lot of this is, when are we willing to pull the trigger and say, we've done enough, this is good enough to start, good enough for now, safe enough to try. And so in terms of, I think it is more respectful. Well, I think that there could be some refinements in taking this out to Joey and any of Heather's contacts who would be willing to give us, a half an hour of time, and say, having a quick pitch. Here is, in 5 minutes, this is what we're trying to do, and this is the legal structure what we're proposing. What are your thoughts? Would you be interested? Would you be willing to get involved in something like this? And what are your concerns? And, as many people as we can talk to between now and when we're ready to hit the file button. And I don't think it has to happen. Like if we can contact Joey, if we can get some of Joey's time, that would be great. If we can't, I don't think we should delay. Same with Heather's contacts, if some of them are willing to talk to us. Same with Brad, Brad and Bernie. So I think as long as we can, I think that the real question is agreeing on that's, if we can say we're just going to use the multi-stakeholder diagram, the lifeboat ecosystem, and the multi-stakeholder diagram, and say we considered a lot of options. This is what we're proposing. Something like that. But as long as we have agreement on the presentation, then I think it would be just setting up the meetings. So I think, how do the next steps look? Are we missing anything? Do we need to refine them? Over to you, Becca.
That sounds great. I think it would be good to have the loop with the lawyers before having those meetings with the outreach, so that we are pretty sure this is what we're planning. So that we're a little that step more sure that this is what we're planning. Although we might be able to start scheduling them.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the 30-minute click thing. I think my skepticism was, how likely are we going to actually be using a boilerplate? But maybe we will, and all the refinements are going to be in the bylaws and the operating agreements and stuff. And yes, to the basic, the two diagrams that you mentioned. I mean, I think there probably needs to also be here's what the Lifeboat Academy is, big, 10,000-foot view. And then here's the diagram of the ecosystem, and then here's the legal entity that we think can incorporate all of these roles, and that has room to grow in ways that we've thought about. Well, would this work for you? And if not, we can tell you other options that we also might consider. Yeah, and I want to save a little time to talk about possible trip to visit over to Roland.
I think that all looks good. I'd like to add to the name of people to consult, Steph.
Mm-hmm.
Which actually leads to the thing that I wanted to add to the agenda. We have a few people who are part of the finance and legal who haven't been attending, and I wanted to check in around that in terms of, should I extend a hand, like re-invite. I was thinking, I'm not sure if Steph is feeling like, because our offer fell through, is she uncomfortable about coming, or if she thinks, anyway. So just sort of re-extending an invitation to Steph and Barbara, and those are the two main ones that I'm thinking about. So that's my last little bit of checking in with you folks around if there's anything to do there. And in the spirit of, still just trying to treat people like people, and checking in. So over to you, Ben.
Yeah, this is all sounding like a good plan to me. I'm just trying to add. Right. And
with egg.
Where? Oh, yeah, that was agree.
Oh, you just erased.
Because I feel like we are agreed now. I like your proposal, and so it is right. And I'm just in my mind, I'm making a distinction that while we still have an open question of what the legal structure is, there's different questions to ask. And then once we decide this is what we're doing, we have just formed our co-op, then it's really more of a question of, do you want to be in? Like I am really curious about, this has been my experience with other organizations around, every time you have these debates about bylaws, while it's an open question, it's just, oh my God, there's so much, it's so complicated, I don't know. And then once you decide, everyone's like, oh yeah, sure, fine. It's just like, sure, that's okay. Now it's just a thing and we just move on. So I feel like I'm curious to see what on the far side it looks like. Um, okay, so I feel like, and then I think that extending the invitations, um, for me, I think that loops into a bigger, like a seasonal check-in for each of the guilds should be, I think for all of the guilds, should just be, hey, just checking in on, because we have said that there isn't an expectation that you have to show up at the meetings. You can be part of the guild and monitor what's going on, and then, dive in when you feel called to it. So, no one's doing anything wrong. But it makes sense to sort of check in on people's level of commitment and, moving forward. So, moving forward into the fall, how do you want to be? We're noticing you're not coming to the meetings. Do you want to still be on the newsletter? Is there a problem with the timing? So I think it's a great idea. And I think there is a natural sort of a periodic reason to be doing that kind of outreach, check-in. So makes a lot of sense to me. So are we good on next steps? I feel like there's clarity. Anything to add, Becca, over to you.
Just maybe you're intending already to include these folks, but I remember at some charrette like a year and a half ago, there was people making pledges to, join, put money in. They should be looped in sometime soon,
Mhm.
even if they've fallen off the radar.
Yeah.
Roll on.
Well, and actually that I was thinking along similar lines. One of the other investors that along with Steph and Joey and Heather's contacts is also Jake and Linda, who have also been very very supportive and have helped a lot.
Mhm.
So that's all.
So our
All
next
right.
meeting is August 23rd. Okay.
Okay. That is just before Fall Fair on Pender Island. How exciting.
So, I mean, yeah, one other thing might be if in the email exchange it becomes with the lawyer, it becomes more confusing rather than less, we might just want to see if they're available at our next meeting time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you're going to draft something and go ahead and send it, or do you want
I'll
feedback?
draft it and I'll just, for feedback, I'll send it to the guild just to see if, if I'm missing anything. I really think it'll be dead simple. So, Roland.
Well, I was just thinking of oh, am I still here?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yes,
Oh,
you are.
my computer just did something weird, so I'm going to talk really fast in case it shuts down. I was just thinking.
Oh.
Not fast enough.
Not fast enough. Well, I take that as a sign from the universe.
He knows where to find you.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just include it in the email.
Okay.
So awesome. Okay, nice to see you, and
Okay,
hopefully we'll
thanks.
see you in the flesh soon. So, bye.
Okay. Bye.